A flaming alien skull bounced across the pine needle forest floor and rolled to a stop at the foot of a rusted World War II tank. Steam hissed from its twisted metal jaws, still grinning in disbelief. From within the shadows of the turret, something creaked. Then a voice, scratchy like a vinyl record left in the sun, muttered, "That'll teach him to laugh at old girls." Somewhere above, a Varnock war drone shrieked like a rusty blender. Deep in the Canadian woods, Frank Donnelly cracked open a beer, adjusted the deer skull on his head, and said to nobody in particular, "I told y'all this tank ain't just for show." The first alien attack was spectacular and absurd. A light show above Toronto, a booming message about cleansing the inefficient species. And then 15 minutes later, skyscrapers fell like dominoes in a drunken bar fight. The Varnock weren't here for diplomacy. They were here to hunt, catalog, and cackle. And they especially loved mocking Earth's old tech, calling it vintage relic theater. They beamed videos across their networks of tanks turned into birdbaths, jets used as art installations, and nukes displayed like primitive fossils. It was all a joke to them. Until they found the tank. Frank Donnelly hadn't spoken to another human in 4 years. His last conversation was with a moose he named Clarence. These days he spent most of his time in a junkyard fortified with bear traps, barbed wire, and paranoia. The crown jewel of his hoard was Betsy, an old M4 Sherman tank he salvaged from a military museum before it was sold for scrap. He didn't know much about her history, only that she looked mean and felt oddly aware. On quiet nights, she creaked like she was trying to speak, but Frank chalked it up to wind and bad chili. That morning, he woke up to the sound of laughter. Not the good kind, alien laughter, loud and metallic, echoing across frequencies no human should hear. They'd found him. 5 Varnock scouts hovered over his compound in glistening black craft that looked like inverted blenders. One of them shone a beam down on Betsy and projected a hologram of a Varnock snorting purple goo from its nasal slits and falling over in mockery. Then they broadcasted galaxy-wide with the caption, "Primitive relic defending food source cave." Hilarious. Frank stood in his long johns, scratched his belly, and muttered, "Well, that's rude." He didn't have much time to plan. A blast from one of the hovercrafts knocked over his outhouse and set fire to his rainwater collector. He ducked behind Betsy and instinctively slapped her rusty hull. "All right, girl," he whispered. "If you've got anything left in those guts of yours, now would be a fine time to show it." She responded with a low whine, followed by a violent shudder. Dust burst from her seams. A compartment opened, revealing a glimmering blue cylinder, definitely not standard World War II issue. Before Frank could say, "Alien conspiracy," Betsy roared to life. Her turret spun faster than seemed possible, locked onto the Varnock scout ships, and with a thunderous boom that split the air like an angry god clearing its throat, she fired. The shell tore through the trees, curved midair, somehow, and turned one of the hovercrafts into glittering debris. The others barely had time to react before Betsy fired again, twice more, straight through the dense Canadian forest, leaving smoldering gaps where mighty pines once stood. All that remained of the Varnock scouts were smoking metal ribs and confused squirrels. Frank fell backward, beer still in hand, and stared at the tank. "You've been holding out on me," he muttered. That night, Frank sat by a fire and watched Betsy hum quietly to herself. Not literally, of course, except yes, literally. She was humming something that sounded suspiciously like "Fortunate Son," and her barrel twitched in rhythm. Frank finally stood up and approached her. "All right, Bets," he said. What are you?" She replied with a mechanical wheeze that resolved into words. "Call me Betsy. And don't touch my levers." Frank dropped his beer. "You talk?" "Unfortunately, yes. You wouldn't believe how long I've been stuck listening to your survivalist podcasts. Real brain melters." Frank blinked. The tank had attitude. Sarcasm. Possibly a soul. He was torn between running for the hills and hugging her. "What are you?" "Classified. But let's say I'm a mash-up of Cold War paranoia, stolen alien tech, and one very pissed-off consciousness that got left in a shed for 40 years. You're welcome. Frank paced in circles. Aliens are real. You're real. You just fired a shot that curved like it had GPS and a grudge. What else don't I know? Plenty, she said. Like the fact that this world's about to become a buffet for tentacle-faced thrill-seekers if we don't act. And you're the only one with a working pulse who knows how to operate me without crashing into a barn. Frank stared at her, and then at the distant sky, where another Varnock cruiser blinked into view. I can't drive a tank, he said. You will, she replied. Or we both become a footnote in alien comedy history. And that's how it began. A rusted tank, a disgruntled veteran, and an accidental war declaration against a species that considered Earth a joke. The universe had laughed at them. But Betsy had the last laugh. It echoed through the trees, through the stars, and into the depths of Varnock High Command, where fear finally replaced smugness. Somewhere in the woods, a squirrel sneezed, and Frank muttered, Even the rodents are in shock. Tomorrow, he'd have to find survivors, allies, and possibly pants. But tonight, he sat beside the tank, listening to her hum, watching the trees sway gently in the aftermath of battle, and wondering what other surprises were buried in that rusted shell. Betsy interrupted his thoughts. Hey, Frank. Yeah? Next time, let's fire first. Laugh later. Frank didn't sleep much the night after the tank started talking. It's not easy catching rest when a semi-sentient machine with a snarky personality and alien weaponry is parked 5 feet from your sleeping bag, humming Johnny Cash and occasionally muttering phrases in what sounded like Russian but might have been Klingon. By morning, he was groggy, cranky, and slightly terrified, but determined. If Betsy was the only thing on Earth that could actually stand up to the alien invaders, he had to figure out how to use her. Or more accurately, how not to get himself killed trying. Breakfast was cold beans, a cigarette, and a conversation with a tank. Frank paced outside as Betsy warmed her systems. She wasn't just humming anymore, she was cycling through military radio channels, some of which hadn't been active since the Cold War. He heard fragments of old commands, ghost signals echoing through frequencies long forgotten. Betsy was searching, scanning, remembering. Or dreaming. Frank couldn't decide which idea was more disturbing. So, he said, scratching his head, how much of you is alien? There was a long pause before Betsy responded. Let's just say I was born in Detroit and reborn in Area 51. That work for you? Not even slightly. Good. Keeps the mystery alive. Frank climbed onto her hull and peeked inside the turret. He'd expected wires, dust, maybe a raccoon. What he found was a hybrid mess of analog dials, touchscreen panels, and something that looked suspiciously like a jellyfish pulsing behind reinforced glass. It blinked once, maybe in acknowledgement. Frank blinked back. I'm gonna pretend I didn't see that. Good choice, Betsy said. It doesn't like being stared at. It's part of my core. Long story. Don't ask. He slid back down and muttered. You're the weirdest tank I've ever met. I'm also the only one currently not vaporized. Shall we move on? As if on cue, a low-pitched alarm echoed from the tree line. A scout drone, silver and sleek, zipped between the branches. It was small, fast, and armed. Frank reached for his rifle instinctively, then remembered how that worked out last time. He dove behind a tree. Betsy rotated her turret with a smooth, almost bored motion and fired a single pulse. The drone exploded with a puff of blue mist and a sound like a whoopee cushion being stepped on by a moose. Target neutralized, she said flatly. Now, can we please talk about training? Frank peeked from behind the tree, grumbling. Training? I drove a forklift in '92. That count? No. You're going to need to know how to drive me without us ending up inside a lake or backwards in a barn. The next few hours were a crash course in tank handling, weapons calibration, and arguing with machinery. Frank learned that Betsy had at least 3 firing modes, a cloaking system that only worked when she wasn't annoyed, and an ejection seat he absolutely should not touch. He also discovered that she enjoyed making sudden turns just to watch him fall over. "You're doing this on purpose," Frank growled, rubbing his elbow. "Of course I am. You told me yesterday I was just a pile of scrap with indigestion. Pay back, Frank. Great. I'm being trained by hell with a grudge." Around midday, the Resistance found them. Well, stumbled into them, really. A group of 5 bedraggled humans emerged from the forest clearing, armed with homemade rifles, slingshots, and one woman wielding a sharpened garden rake like it was a samurai sword. Their leader was a wiry teen named Sasha, dressed in layers of scavenged clothing and goggles that looked lifted from a welding shop. "Holy crap," she said, staring at Betsy. "Is that a tank?" Frank lit a cigarette and grunted. "Yup. And it works?" "She talks." Sasha blinked. "She what now?" Betsy chose that moment to speak. "Hello? I'm Betsy. I'm the last decent war machine on Earth, and currently saddled with a human who smells like sadness and canned meat." The group jumped back. One of them fainted. Sasha laughed so hard she nearly dropped her rake. "You weren't kidding," she said, stepping forward cautiously. "We've been trying to rig up lawnmowers with missile launchers. You've got a talking tank." Frank nodded. "And apparently I'm the chosen one." "You're what now?" I was also surprised. The Resistance group brought news. The Varnak had started taking prisoners. Not for experiments, but for sport. They'd turn them loose in hunting reserves, forests and urban ruins, then broadcast the chase across their networks. The aliens weren't just conquerors. They were entertainment addicts. And Earth was their new favorite reality show. Frank clenched his fists. Betsy made a low growling noise, more vibration than sound. Sasha and her crew had lost friends. Whole towns were gone. But hearing the tank hum with anger gave them hope. The war wasn't over. Not yet. That night, they sat around a campfire while Betsy powered down into sleep mode, her turret gently turning every now and then, like a dog twitching in a dream. Sasha told stories of makeshift battles, rigged traps, and scavenged tech. Frank told tales of his time in the army, which might have been exaggerated, but no one cared. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. Then came the siren. A high-pitched wail, followed by a ripple in the trees. The forest went silent. Birds vanished. Sasha stood up, eyes wide. "They're coming." Frank reached for his rifle, then remembered again how little it would help. Betsy's engine roared awake before he could shout. Her lights flickered to life. She was angry. Not just online, but furious. 5 alien drones dropped into the clearing, sleek and glowing, followed by a larger hovercraft that hummed with deadly intent. They expected a few scared humans. They got a tank with a vendetta. Betsy fired. The first drone shattered. The second tried to dodge and hit a tree. The third made the mistake of flying directly at her. Betsy launched a shell that disintegrated in midair and sent a shockwave through the ground. The big hovercraft fired a plasma blast that hit Betsy's side, leaving a black scar and knocking Frank backward. She screamed, her systems howling, sparks flying, and retaliated with a pulse round that bent through the trees and sliced the craft clean in two. It wasn't a clean fight. One of Sasha's group was hit, and a tent caught fire. But by the end of it, the forest was still. Betsy smoked and sizzled but stood strong. Frank limped to her side, coughing, heart pounding. "You okay?" he asked. Betsy's voice was weak but clear. "Been through worse." "You?" Frank looked around. Fires, bodies, trees split like matchsticks. "I've had weirder Tuesdays." And as the Resistance crew gathered around the battered tank, they realized they weren't just survivors anymore. They were a team. An army. And their general had treads, sarcasm, and a very big gun. The Varnak High Command was not used to being embarrassed. Certainly not by a rusted Earth machine from a war so old it was considered folklore among their analysts. The footage of their elite recon drones exploding in a burst of Earth metal shrapnel had been watched, rewatched, slowed down, mimified, and reluctantly archived under a threat level they hadn't used since the Guam incident. Inside the command center aboard the orbiting mothership, shaped like a giant obsidian tooth and the size of Manhattan, General Threx paced in slow, deliberate circles around the holographic display of Earth. His tendrils twitched. One of his lieutenants, an insected creature with a translator collar and a nervous tick that made its eye stalks bob in rhythm, broke the silence. "The tank. It's persistent." Threx didn't respond immediately. He was still watching the explosion replay from one of the forest drone's final transmissions. The tank had fired a shell that appeared to ricochet between trees, taking out not just the drone but the communication beacon behind it. The odds of such a shot were incalculable. Unless the tank had some sort of guidance system or psychic gunner, both of which were impossible. Or at least had been. Until now. Threx turned slowly. "It is not just a tank. It is a symbol. And symbols infect morale. I want it destroyed." The lieutenant cleared his throat, or whatever part of his anatomy resembled a throat. "With respect, General, direct engagement has failed. It moves with the humans. Its operator is unpredictable." "Then isolate it," Threx snapped. "Let's see how it performs without its driver." Meanwhile, on Earth, Frank was starting to regret ever fixing Betsy in the first place. Not because he didn't like her, on the contrary, he was starting to care a little too much about a machine that insulted him hourly, and refused to explain half her functions. No, it was because everywhere they went now, someone either wanted to recruit them or vaporize them. They hadn't had a proper meal in days, and Frank's back was starting to fuse into the tank's seat from too many hours driving through backwoods and mudslides. The resistance had grown. What started as 5 survivors with homemade weapons had turned into nearly 50, thanks to Betsy's very public demolition of Varnak forces. Word spread fast in the ruins. People believed again. Or at least they hoped. The camp they'd set up outside an abandoned hydroelectric station was primitive but alive. Kids ran between tents. Old-timers fixed radios. Someone had even built a brick oven and was experimenting with pizza, though Frank swore one tasted like a pinecone. Betsy parked near the edge of the treeline, her systems humming softly as she recharged using a mishmash of solar rigs and stolen alien batteries. Frank sat nearby on a folding chair, cleaning his rifle more out of habit than need. Sasha walked up beside him and handed him a cup of coffee so strong it nearly burned a hole in his cup. "You know they're all starting to think you're some kind of messiah," she said, smirking. Frank spat into the dirt. "I'm barely qualified to fix a toaster." "Messiah, my ass." "Doesn't matter," she said. "You've got the tank. And we've got nothing else." Frank looked out over the camp. People were laughing, building, repairing. For a moment, it didn't look like the end of the world. But he knew better. They hadn't seen real retaliation yet. The Varnak were prideful. They were also calculating. He knew something was coming. Something big. It arrived the next night. The EMP blast struck without warning. A soundless ripple of energy spread across the sky, like someone had slapped the air with a cosmic hand. Lights went out. Generators whined. Radios died mid-transmission. Betsy screamed. Not mechanically. Not figuratively. She emitted a sound so full of pain, rage, and confusion that every human within 100 meters collapsed to their knees. Frank ran toward her, stumbling through dead firelight and static haze. Her hull sparked. Her systems glitched. Her voice came in bursts, fragmented. "Frank, core, disrupt, Hertz, no." Then silence. Smoke rose from her vents. The blue glow from her alien power core flickered, then went out entirely. Frank climbed on top, hands burning from the heat, and pounded on the turret. "Come on, Bets," he whispered. "Don't you quit on me now. Don't you dare." But she was silent. The camp went into chaos. Without Betsy, they were vulnerable. Worse, the signal had clearly been targeted. Someone knew where she was. Someone had waited for them to lower their guard. Frank sat beside the tank the entire night, wrapped in a blanket, unmoving. Others tried to console him. Sasha brought food. A kid brought a hand-drawn picture of the tank saving the world. Nothing got through. Morning brought fog and a visitor. She emerged from the mist like something out of a story. Old, tall, wrapped in military garb, too crisp for a scavenger. Her hair was white, pulled into a severe bun, and she walked with a cane that clicked with precision. Her name was Dr. Miriam Holloway. Once a lead scientist on classified weapons development for NATO, now presumed dead. Instead, she had been hiding in the woods, observing. Waiting. Frank didn't trust her. But she knew Betsy. Knew her better than anyone else. She was part of Project Echo Wraith, Holloway explained. We salvaged alien technology in the 60s. Integrated it into vehicles. Most of them failed. Too unstable. Betsy was the only one that survived long term. She's alive, Frank said, staring at the tank. Yes, Holloway replied. And if you want her back, we'll need to do something stupid. Frank's eyes narrowed. How stupid? Alien core surgery using stolen Varnock power cells and a jury-rigged consciousness stabilizer that I built out of a blender, a transistor radio, and a car battery. Frank nodded slowly. So Tuesday. They worked in silence, under camouflage netting, deep in the forest. Sasha guarded the perimeter. Drones buzzed overhead, but nothing attacked. The Varnock were waiting. Watching. Betsy lay dormant, open like a sleeping dragon, her innards exposed and twitching. Frank handed tools. Holloway did the rest. The power cell, once pulsing red with alien energy, now glowed a soft blue. She inserted it into Betsy's core with a reverent precision. The machine trembled. Frank leaned in close. Bets? No answer. He gritted his teeth. Betsy, you old metal witch! I swear if you don't wake up, I'll turn you into a beer fridge. The lights flickered. Then surged. Her voice, raspy but proud, echoed through the woods. Frank. You smell worse than ever. Frank grinned. Welcome back. And from deep in the forest, a Varnock camera drone watched the tank rise, systems glowing, and silently transmitted a warning back to the mothership. The tank was awake. And it was angry. The forest was still recovering from the shock of Betsy's rebirth. Animals had scattered. The trees closest to her had begun to wilt from residual energy. Frank stood next to her, his face lit by the pale blue glow pulsing from her newly repaired core. Dr. Holloway sat on an overturned crate, scribbling frantically in a notebook while muttering theories to herself that Frank didn't understand and didn't want to. Sasha leaned against a tree, arms crossed, watching the tank like it might start levitating. Which, given everything else they'd seen, wasn't off the table. Betsy didn't speak at first. Her systems ran diagnostics silently, her armor humming like a giant mechanical lung inhaling for the first time in days. Then, slowly, her turret moved left, then right, with deliberate smoothness. Her voice came through a second later, less distorted now, but with an unmistakable edge. You let a scientist poke around in my guts, she said flatly. Without warning. Frank shrugged. You were dead. Or something close to it. I was napping. Aggressively. You screamed like a banshee and shut down completely. Fine. I was emotionally recharging. Frank rolled his eyes and turned to Holloway. Is this normal? Holloway nodded. More or less. She's got a consciousness matrix embedded in semi-sentient alloy. Think of her as a grumpy genius with mood swings and weapons. Betsy interjected. I can hear you. Frank smirked. Good. Then hear this, we've got work to do. Sasha brought intel. The Varnock beacon array is buried somewhere deep in the northern forest. You know what that means? Betsy revved slightly. Road trip? Operation Iron Slingshot, Sasha added, unfolding a hand-drawn map. We hit the beacon, steal or destroy their communications hub, and cripple their ability to coordinate. It's not a final blow, but it's a big one. Betsy scanned the map. Looks like a minefield inside a forest wrapped in fog and guarded by cloaking drones. What's the backup plan? There isn't one, Sasha said. We either pull it off, or we go back to hiding and hoping. Frank climbed into Betsy's hatch, slid into the seat, and took a deep breath. Then let's make this one count. They moved at dusk. A convoy of mismatched vehicles followed them, old trucks welded with armor plates, dirt bikes with alien battery cores, even a modified school bus turned into a mobile command post. Frank rode in silence. He could feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. The forest grew darker, denser, and strangely quieter as they entered the northern region. No birds. No insects. Just the sound of engines and branches crunching under treads. Then Betsy stopped. She rotated her barrel slightly. Something's wrong. Frank peered through the scope. The trees ahead shimmered, just faintly, like heat rising from asphalt. He adjusted the lens and spotted them. Cloaked drones. Dozens. Hanging in the air like metal wasps. Waiting. It's a kill zone, Sasha whispered over the comm. We'll never make it through. Betsy purred. Watch me. Frank clenched the controls. Betsy shifted gears, her frame lowering slightly. A panel opened on her side, revealing a strange glowing module the others hadn't seen before. That's new, Frank said. Let's call it the equalizer. She fired. The shell exploded not on impact but midair. It didn't destroy the drones. It lit them up, outlined them in electric blue like ghosts under a black light. Suddenly they were visible. Vulnerable. Frank opened fire. Sasha's team followed. The convoy unleashed a storm of chaos. Drones burst like firecrackers. Trees splintered. One of the trucks veered off and slammed into a rock, but the rest pushed through. Betsy led the charge, her cannon a relentless rhythm of destruction. The forest fought back. Alien sentry pods emerged from underground, launching net-like projectiles. One tangled around Betsy's treads, but she pulsed her core and vaporized it in a burst of searing light. Frank was sweating, swearing, and grinning like a lunatic. We're close, Sasha said, pointing to a clearing ahead. The beacon's in there. The clearing was worse than they expected. The beacon tower loomed like a jagged tree made of obsidian and lightning. Around it stood a Varnak Titan, a six-legged monstrosity with armor like liquid stone and cannons mounted where a head should have been. Betsy groaned. Oh good. A mini-boss. Frank's hands flew over the controls. She surged forward. The Titan turned. They fired at the same time. The blast threw Betsy sideways, sending Frank slamming into the turret wall. Sparks flew. Panels cracked. Smoke filled the cockpit. Betsy's voice cut in and out. Core, overloading, stabilizer, needs reboot. Frank coughed, slammed a fist into the dashboard. Bets. Stay with me. Reboot in 30 seconds. The Titan loomed closer. Sasha's voice cracked through the comm. Frank, it's charging again. Frank looked around the cabin. Saw the manual override lever Betsy had always told him never to touch. He touched it. Suddenly, controls surged into his arms. Betsy wasn't just guiding him, he was in full control. It felt like holding on to a dragon's spine mid-flight. The world tilted. He aimed. The beacon was behind the Titan. No time to go around. So he fired a shot, not at the Titan, but at the massive tree beside it. The shell hit the trunk, ricocheted off, bounced against another tree, curved between two boulders, and struck the beacon dead center. The entire tower exploded in a burst of blue flame and crackling static. The Titan reeled, its systems disrupted. Frank didn't wait. He fired again, point blank. The shell hit the Titan's chest and ignited its core. The explosion lit the forest like sunrise. Then silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Betsy coughed, an actual coughing sound somehow, and groaned. That was the dumbest shot I've ever seen. You beautiful idiot. Frank laughed, collapsed back in his seat. Sasha's voice returned, hoarse but thrilled. We did it. The beacon's down. They're blind. Around them, the surviving convoy rolled in, whooping and cheering. The battle was over. For now. Frank slid out of the hatch, collapsed onto the forest floor, and looked up at the smoking sky. "What now?" he asked aloud. Betsy's voice was softer this time. "Now, we make sure they never get back up." The final sky wasn't quiet. It trembled with streaks of descending fire, falling debris, and the distant hum of engines that didn't belong to Earth. The Varnak mothership had begun shifting in orbit, a subtle tilt that meant only one thing to those who knew war: retaliation was coming. Real, full-scale, planetary-level retaliation. No more scouts. No more small games in the forest. This was going to be the end of something. Maybe everything. But humanity wasn't waiting to find out. Not this time. Frank stared at the horizon from the ridge, eyes bloodshot, face smudged with ash, one boot taped together with electrical wire. Behind him, Betsy sat silent and steaming, her hull dented and darkened from the last assault. She hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, and Frank didn't know if it was because she was recharging or angry. Or both. Probably both. Sasha stood next to him, visor up, holding the communicator that now connected resistance cells from across the continent. Every voice that chimed in was tense but determined. They had a plan now. For the first time since this started, the plan didn't sound like suicide. Just a really bad idea with a chance. They called it Operation Last Laugh. Appropriate, considering the origin of their resistance came from a tank that made alien warlords laugh, and then blew half their scouts into mist. The stolen comm codes from the destroyed beacon had revealed a vulnerability. The Varnak's mothership was anchored to Earth's orbit by a gravitational tether relay positioned inside their planetary base in the Rockies. Disabling the tether would cause the mothership to drift off balance long enough to expose its central core for a few minutes. Just a few. But it was enough. If they hit it right. Of course, hitting it meant someone had to fly. And flying meant getting into one of their ships without dying, stealing it, getting it into the atmosphere, then launching a direct strike while the rest of the resistance distracted everything on the ground. No one volunteered. Frank didn't ask. He just looked at Betsy and said, "If you can get me close, I can take the shot." That was it. No long speeches. No dramatic music. Just two tired warriors and a ridiculous plan. The morning of the assault, the camp buzzed with motion. Makeshift units rolled out on everything from scavenged motorcycles to up-armored delivery vans. Drones were rigged with explosives. Kids carried ammo. A grandma with a crossbow gave Frank a thumbs up and said, "Don't you come back without a fireworks show, you hear?" He saluted her with the same half-sincere energy he'd used during basic training decades ago. It felt good. Real. Human. Betsy finally spoke again as the convoy assembled. Her voice was quieter than usual. Not weaker but thoughtful. "You know we're not coming back from this," she said. Frank leaned against her side. "Not planning on it. But we're going out big." She rumbled a little, maybe laughter, maybe just warming up. "We better. If we mess this up, I swear I'll haunt your next microwave." They rolled out at dawn, kicking up dust trails as they cut through the broken remnants of the highway. Above, the mothership cast a long shadow across the land, a crescent of metal and malice. The Varnak had begun deploying mass walkers, giant machines that looked like insects crossed with cathedrals. They crushed buildings as they moved. But the humans didn't stop. They roared past them, through them, under them. The resistance had grown bold. Betsy led the charge, blasting paths through the enemy like a blunt instrument of divine fury. The base in the Rockies was worse than they expected. Massive. Buried. Guarded by a legion of Varnak elites with armor that shimmered like oil and weapons that sang when fired. Betsy took hit after hit, but she pushed forward, shielding the human squad as they broke through gate after gate. Frank stayed locked in, controlling her movements with precision now, no hesitation, no fear. He was connected to her in a way he couldn't explain, like her circuits and his nerves were echoing the same thoughts. They reached the core chamber just as the resistance above launched the skyward barrage. Explosions lit the heavens. The Varnak mothership began to tremble. Frank looked up and knew they had only minutes to breach the final line. Then, from the far end of the chamber, came the towering form of General Threx. Larger now. Mutated. Wearing some kind of exosuit fused with alien tech and human parts. Frank recognized pieces of downed aircraft grafted onto him, like trophies. Threx spoke in a language that made the walls vibrate, but the message was clear. You are insects. Delusions in skin. This world is not yours to save. Frank climbed out of the hatch and faced him. We were never trying to save it. Just trying to make you bleed a little before we go. Threx roared and charged. Betsy fired, but Threx moved fast, too fast. He dodged the shot, leapt onto her hull, and began tearing through her side like a rabid beast. Sparks flew. Panels cracked. Betsy screamed. Frank jumped onto Threx's back, using a crowbar to smash into the cables and tubes that connected his suit to the core. It was chaos. Violent. Desperate. Threx flung him off, but not before Frank ripped free a glowing device from the center of his chest. The room shook. The relay station began to collapse. Sasha's voice came through the comm. The window is open. You have 30 seconds. Betsy's systems were on fire. Her voice came in and out. I can't stabilize long enough. You need to launch the shot manually. Frank dragged himself back into the cockpit. The targeting system was barely functioning. Smoke filled the space. He lined up the shot using instinct, memory, and fury. Then he pressed the trigger. The shell flew out like a comet, arcing upward, through the collapsing mountain ceiling, past the clouds, and into the exposed belly of the Varnak mothership. For a brief second, everything went silent. Then the sky exploded. The core of the mothership ruptured, sending a shockwave across the atmosphere. Alien systems shorted. Ships dropped from the air. Ground troops screamed and vanished in flashes of light. The tether relay disintegrated. Betsy collapsed. Frank sat inside, coughing, bleeding, staring at the screens that had gone black. He smiled. Did we get M? He asked softly. Silence. Then a faint voice, weak but still stubborn. Yeah, Frank. We got M. The next thing he remembered was light. Blinding, cold air rushing past him. He was falling. Ejected. The last command Betsy gave was to save him. The trees rushed up to meet him, but he landed in the branches, crashing through pine after pine before slamming into the forest floor with a groan. When he opened his eyes, Sasha was there, dragging him out of the wreckage, smiling through tears. The war wasn't over yet. But the world had changed. And somewhere in the silence, deep beneath rubble and forest, a faint echo hummed through the broken circuits of a rusted tank that once made the stars tremble.